Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here this afternoon and for joining us for our conversation on an important conversation about the nation's largest and largely least accountable law enforcement agency, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. My name is Sarah Turberville, and I direct the Constitution Project here at the Project on Government Oversight, POGO. And at POGO, we seek to expose when the government engages in corruption and abuse of power and seek solutions that will better ensure that the government hews to constitutional principles. Our organization is working to evolve into one that centers justice and equity in our mission, and police accountability, of course, is a central component of all of this work. We know that there is much that is misunderstood and ignored about the authority, the integrity, and the accountability of Customs and Border Protection. And if they're, we often, when we think about CBP, we're sort of mindful of the future and think about that if there's a singular law enforcement agency in the US that is primed to sort of serve as some kind of internal security service under a more authoritarian government in our country, it is CBP. I should say, though, that we're certainly not alone in this work to bring more accountability to this agency. We stand alongside many amazing folks doing incredible work along border communities, groups and individuals who are directly affected by the actions of the federal government under the auspices of immigration enforcement. And we have one of those folks and those organizations as part of that conversation today. I will get to our fantastic panelists in a moment. And who will tell you more about this topic of discussion. But for now, let me tell you who they are. To what is my right, we've got Lilian Serrano, or Lily, who comes from a family that has resided in the Tijuana, San Diego border region for 3 generations. She became civically active as a high school student in 2006 when a series of anti-immigrant proposals in the US Congress sparked national mobilization for immigrant rights. Lily is the new-ish, I guess, director of the Southern Border Communities Coalition, or SBCC, which brings together networks from across the southern border to promote policies and solutions that improve the quality of life for border residents. At SBCC, she has helped to shape the coalition and ensure that human rights are respected in the border region. And then on my left, we're joined by Katherine Hawkins, my colleague at POGO, who is a senior legal analyst here at the organization. Katherine focuses on national security, immigration, and human rights. She was previously a policy counsel and investigator at the Constitution Project before we merged with POGO, and was a national security fellow for Open the Government. Katherine is also one of the leading experts on the US government's use of torture after September 11th, and has published extensively on that subject as well. So I have just a couple logistics before we jump in. We have, we really very much want this to be a conversation, not sort of a series of presentations. And so our format will be one of Q&A. I'll ask a few questions to get us started, and then I'll turn pretty quickly to any questions that might come in from the audience. Some of you have also submitted questions in advance, and so I'll be sure to get to as many of those as we can as well. If you'd like to ask a question, just post it in the chat, and then we should be able to get to it that way. We'll also be sharing some resources in the chat, so I want to be sure that folks are watching that, and that's places where you can get more information or find resources to take action. All right, so with all that said, I'd like to first start us off with a question to Lily about how people think of CBP and of Border Patrol in particular as an immigration enforcement agency. But can you give our audience a fuller accounting of Border Patrol's authority and jurisdiction in the United States?
Yeah, well, first, thank you to POGO for the invitation to share a little bit with all of you today about the realities for border communities, about what we see on a daily basis in our communities, and really the challenges of having to live under CBP and specifically Border Patrol. I guess having to interact with these agencies. I know that, you know, for folks who are outside of the border region or specifically outside of the southern border, you might not be as familiar with who Border Patrol is or who CBP is. So just very briefly, CBP is an agency under the Department of Homeland Security that our Border Patrol, who is in charge of patrolling the border in between the ports of entry, and then OFO, or the Office of Field Operations, which are in charge of all the work that is done at the ports in terms of customs, right? So all the products that are coming in and out of our through our border, and then also screening people, whether those be immigrants, those be citizens who are traveling, and or residents, or, you know, just all the different varieties of visas that we have. So for CBP or Border Patrol, they are the largest law enforcement agency in the country. And even though a lot of their authority really derives from immigration enforcement, because of their powers that they were given by US Congress, they actually operate as a law enforcement federal entity. They have the powers to stop and search folks without a warrant within 100 miles. And if we were to, you know, mark where the 100-mile zone is in the United States, and I should clarify, 100 miles from all points of entry into the country. That means that about 2/3 of US population would live within a 100-mile zone or within a CBP jurisdiction. Historically, they've been primarily concentrated in the southern border, even though we're seeing an increase on enforcement presence in the northern border. But, you know, I'm located in California. So for us in the state of California, the vast majority of the territory is within the 100-mile. So that means that the San Diego sector, which is where I currently live, has jurisdiction all the way to the Oregon border. That's pretty much covers most of the state of California. And, you know, that same is true for a lot of the metropolitan areas in our country. A lot of the major cities in our country are technically within the 100-mile zone, meaning that CBP has the power to operate as a law enforcement in this region.
Thank you, Lily. I would love it, maybe, Katherine, if you could expand a little bit on some of Lily's introduction to sort of the authority and jurisdiction of Border Patrol. And here, maybe you could talk to us about the legal rules. You know, when we talk about law enforcement authority, what does that exactly mean? And, you know, there's legal rules that law enforcement in the US is meant to follow, and why Border Patrol appears to operate outside the parameters that are set by those rules and laws.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lily. One of the most basic legal rules that law enforcement is subject to is the Fourth Amendment, prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures. And in most cases, that means searches have to be conducted with a warrant and with probable cause. There are a lot of exceptions to the warrant requirement, even for ordinary police, but the Border Patrol is largely exempt from the probable cause requirement wherever they operate. So within that 100-mile zone, which includes, it includes just, you know, just to put a fine point on it, I wouldn't really call myself a border resident. I've lived most of my life in the Northeast, a few years in Chicago, but all of New England, almost all of the state of New York, Washington, DC, is all considered the border zone within the regulatory definition. And so within that 100-mile zone, Border Patrol can pull people over based on a standard called reasonable suspicion, and can set up checkpoints where they stop people and ask about their immigration status based on essentially no suspicion. That said, where that jurisdiction is actually most heavily concentrated is along the US-Mexico border in practice. And so that another basic constitutional protection for law enforcement, and again, this isn't, I would never claim that there's great compliance with this universally, but there's the Equal Protection Clause. Law enforcement is not supposed to engage in disparate treatment based on race, but there are Supreme Court precedents saying the Border Patrol is allowed to do that because it's considered to be a reasonable proxy for immigration status, which is both wrong, but also, it's inaccurate, increasingly inaccurate. I mean, I think a lot of the places where the Border Patrol operates are very heavily Latino among US citizens. And then because they have this immigration authority and quasi-national security authority, it is even more difficult to hold them accountable for violating the law than other law enforcement. If you've heard of qualified immunity for the police, there is another layer where you can't even sue them in the first place because they're not, they're federal, not state officials, and because they're supposed to be a national security function by the border. And then the people who they interact with most often have a difficult time reporting or getting any justice for abuses. There are, they definitely encounter US citizens too, but the main people in their custody are migrants, sometimes, or sometimes citizens of Mexico. And it is extraordinarily difficult to get justice in either criminal court or civil court when they commit wrongdoing.
And one last point about the 100-mile zone that I'd love, maybe both of you could touch on this, is related to the use of checkpoints. These are absolute, like, suspicionless stops of motorists in the border zone region. And presently, they primarily exist along the southern border, and but it is certainly within the authority of CBP to even set up those checkpoints, within the interior of the United States, if it's within that 100-mile zone along coastal regions, right? And I wonder if either of you could sort of speak to what the utility of those checkpoints actually is, and who are the individuals that, and for what reasons they end up arrested after being stopped at a border checkpoint.
Yeah, definitely. Having Border Patrol checkpoints became just a everyday reality for a lot of us in the southern border. There are entire communities that there is no way in and out of the region without having to cross one of these Border Patrol checkpoints. And I mean, they are exactly what they sound, right? It's Border Patrol, sorry, set up at major major freeways, major intersections, where when you are going through, have the authority to stop you, because, and Katherine already explained, they're allowed to use racial profiling as one of the reasons to stops. Folks that they perceive to have connection with Mexico tend to be stopped the most versus a white person. And once you are stopped, right, they ask all kinds of different questions from where are you coming from, right, like your outs and abouts, actively interfering in our, right to freely move within our country, right? A lot of the folks that end up getting stuck in these checkpoints are US citizens like myself, right, that because of our ancestry or our connections might not look white. Also, a lot of the times they do end up creating this kind of secondary border for immigrants who at all times have to be able to prove their status in the country. And of course, if you don't have one, you end up being basically trapped within your community, because once again, there is not a way in and or out of our communities without basically Border Patrol knowing about it and allowing you through. A lot of the enforcement that we end up seeing at the checkpoints ends up being actually with U.S. citizens, who a lot of times are violated by border agents and in attempts to exercise their rights, and that being having negative interactions with the agency. Katherine, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, so my experience with checkpoints personally is like, I've passed through not many, and they say, are you a US citizen? I say yes, and they wave me through without checking an ID. But it's very different. For one thing, if you're going through them all the time, you're more likely to have a bad encounter. And for another, if you look different from the way I look, you're much more likely to be stopped for secondary inspection. A lot of the actual arrests at the checkpoints are of US citizens because although US law enforcement is not allowed to set up generalized drug checkpoints, the Border Patrol can do a secondary, they can have a dog alert and then do a search of a vehicle for drugs. And there are a fair number of drug arrests of US citizens at the checkpoint, which range from, actual smuggling to stories of celebrities getting caught with joints. I think, but there are also really serious abuses. There was one case a few years ago where a child who had cerebral palsy and was going to the hospital for medical treatment was in an ambulance, I believe, and the ambulance was stopped at the checkpoint, and then she was placed under arrest in her hospital room because she was undocumented. And it can be a real barrier to medical care, family visits, other essential travel for people who have lived in the United States for a long time, whatever their immigration status. There's a case where a US citizen was stopped at a checkpoint and they just didn't believe that he was a US citizen, and he was held in Border Patrol custody for like 17 or 18 days and in really horrible conditions. And so it's a real problem. And, right now, as problematic as they are, and as common as they are along the southern border, they aren't used in US cities for the most part, outside of the borders. They aren't present very much along the northern border or the coasts, but the authority is sort of lying around, and that concerns us a lot.
Thank you both. And the issue of sort of the utility of these enforcement activities, right? Of if it's, I think it's primarily Americans who are arrested for drug offenses at border checkpoints, really surfaces here. And I want to just take a moment to maybe do a little bit of myth busting, because there's so much misinformation disseminated concerning the enforcement activities of Border Patrol related to people crossing, related to drug interdiction, et cetera. Katherine, I wonder if you can just maybe spend just a minute, right? Like explaining, right now we're hearing a lot about like fentanyl coming across the border. And can you explain to our audience how, like, who is doing the interdicting, right? When of drugs in the United States?
Sure. So fentanyl is a really serious problem. I think a lot does come into the United States from Mexico. It primarily comes from ports of entry. And, those are like all along the US-Mexico border. There's a series of bridges or other locations where vehicles and people by the hundreds of thousands a day cross into the United States. You know, trucks carrying all sorts of imports. I mean, there's like both sides of the US-Mexico border actually depend on that sort of flow of people, economic activity. It's not, I think it gets portrayed in the news as it's like asylum seekers coming across, and that's the main thing that's going on at the border. But the main thing going on at the border is people are walking back and forth or driving back and forth, going about their daily lives. Now, because of that, because there are so many trucks and cars and vehicles, and because fentanyl is so incredibly concentrated, it is relatively easy to hide large quantities of it, particularly in vehicles or large shipments or cargoes. It used to enter the country primarily, I think, through shipping and mail from China. I think that's shifted to the land ports of entry from Mexico. And I'll post something in the chat about CBP has statistics on where fentanyl is stopped. Overwhelmingly, it's stopped at the ports of entry where it's being smuggled by US citizens because they are subject to much less scrutiny entering the United States. To a lesser extent, the Border Patrol finds some at the vehicle checkpoints. And it is vanishingly rare for asylum seekers or other economic migrants to carry it into the country with them. That's just not where fentanyl is coming from. And I think, unfortunately, the focus on stopping people from coming, you know, there are humanitarian issues, and it's a difficult problem when there's a lot of people coming at once and they get stuck and can't get processed, but focusing exclusively on, I mean, I think the real dangerous things coming into and out of the southern border is overwhelmingly fentanyl coming north through the ports and guns coming south from the United States to Mexico.
Yeah.
Is there more you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to highlight the, what Katherine mentioned of the reality on the border is that, yes, there's people that cross in a daily basis. We know that every given day, about 500,000 people cross the southern border in the United States, right? Just locally here in San Diego, the San Isidro Port of Entry is the busiest and land entry into our country. And, they see more than 40 million people crossing every year, right? And a vast majority of them being US citizens. For those of us how in the southern border, right? Housing is a challenge, just like in the rest of the country. So a lot of US citizens find refuge by just actually living on the southern side of our border. And finding better housing opportunities in Mexico. So that means that US citizens who are living in Mexico cross on a daily basis to go to school, to go to work. Like I said, because of the years of, families setting up on both sides of the border, there's a lot of binational families who are a lot of which are US citizens who are in a constant move in moving back and forth in the US-Mexico border. So even though, like Katherine and Sarah mentioned, when a lot of times when we talk about the goods coming through the border, we talk about asylum seekers, we talk about drugs, but the reality is that most of what moves in between are people. And vast majority of them being US citizens who have all the right to move across, and unfortunately has become more and more difficult for us to be able to exercise that right, in part because of these policies that are brought up to us or under the disguise of being targeting drugs and other illegal activities.
Thank you both. And just to put a final and finer point on it. So then, is it fair to say that fentanyl, for example, is the vast majority of it would be then interdicted by not Border Patrol, but with the Office of Field Operations because they operate at the ports.
Yeah, that's right. And I think just to give people a sense of the Border Patrol, you're much more likely to have, especially if you don't live along the southwest border, but if you've flown into an airport, an international airport, people who inspect your passport there are Office of Field Operations. They do customs inspections. And if you drive over one of the official border crossings into Canada or into Mexico, that's who you're encountering. And yeah, that's where most of the people's scanning a lot of the fentanyl. And I think unfortunately, when there are congressional hearings about this, there's a lot of politicization around the issue and a desire to claim that it's migrants bringing fentanyl. There's also just a little parochial thing where I don't think Border Patrol likes to say like, oh yeah, it's those other guys finding all that fentanyl. So
right. So Lily, I think you've done, for a lot of folks, they probably haven't experienced life along the southern border. And I think that you've done a very nice job of sort of explaining the way that like people and goods cross and how communities live. Like for a lot of people and a lot of families, this US-Mexico border is a rather artificial thing because there's immediate family members living like right on both sides of it. But can you expound a little bit on talking about what the experience is of communities along the southern border with Border Patrol, and what are the other ways that Border Patrol and DHS resources affect life along the border?
Yes. Like I always tell folks, don't think of my community as being a lot more different than yours. The main difference is that mine encounters a different country, right? We don't here in the southern border, and this is true all across. And as a Southern Border Communities Coalition, we do have partners in the four different border states. And what we hear is that for us, our communities don't stop at the international boundary, right? For us, our communities, if anything, center around that border. Ties, our family roots, our culture is very intertwined with Mexico, our economies. But it also means that we have to in a daily operate or live with Border Patrol enforcement, or CBP actually enforcement. Once again, CBP being the largest law enforcement agency in the country. We already talked a little bit about the authorities that they have. And what we haven't talked about is the unfortunate reality for a lot of us, that is having to encounter an agency that uses the violence in a daily basis. Just using CBP's own data, we know that the use of force statistics have been dramatically increasing in the last few years, with last year being a record number. We had almost 1,000 use of force incidents by CBP agents. That average about 2 per day. And the result of some of those encounters is actually community members losing their lives. And when I say community members, I mean residents, long-term residents of the southern border, newcomers, right? Folks that are just arriving to a region, or travelers, right, coming through. That also includes U.S. citizens and immigrants alike. And since 2010, when SBCC was created, we started tracking the fatalities of or the lives lost after encounters with Border Patrol, with CBP agents. And since 2010, and sorry, let me take a step back, because the reason we did that is because before 2010, nobody was counting, right? We had no real government record on how many lives were lost in the hands of CBP agents. So since then, we have counted 270 lives that were taken as a direct result of negative interactions with CBP agents. Some of the most common ways in which these lives were lost were in shootings by CBP agents. But in the last probably couple of years, we have been an increase on vehicle pursuit incidents. So CBP agents following in through different ways, causing accidents in which, once again, we're losing lives, human lives. And not a single agent in the 100 years of the agency has ever been found guilty of violating their own policies, or have ever been been held accountable for the lives lost. So for us, seeing all this violence and this culture of impunity that exists within CBP is very worrisome, especially as, we also know that part of it is because of the permission that the U.S. Congress has given them to operate in that way in our communities.
Thanks. Thank you, Lily. I wonder if we do have a question in the chat I want us to get to, but I feel like there's just sort of a natural segue real quick for a question I want to pitch to Katherine. And that's that, given the wide berth that CBP has or has taken, and Border Patrol in particular, with respect to its authority and its jurisdiction, and the violence that we've seen. Can you talk a little bit, Katherine, the violence committed by some of those agents? Can you talk to our audience some about why it is so difficult for accountability for there to be meaningful accountability within the organization? And then you've talked a little bit about sort of like the legal accountability and trying to hold someone civilly liable in court, but what about sort of internally, right? Like what about internal affairs essentially, and other kinds of mechanisms that should exist with respect to accountability?
Yeah, so I think CBP, the Border Patrol in particular, grew very, very dramatically after September 11th. Counterterrorism was sort of centered as their mission. But, most of the people they encounter are not terrorists. They're, a lot of them are US citizens, a lot of them are migrants who are, may have permission to be here or may not, but, are just not a national security threat. And because they grew so rapidly, there was a real hiring spree, and it did not come with, I think they grew too quickly. There were a lot of really horrible incidents of people being engaging in corruption, sexual assault off duty, sexual assault on duty. There was a serial killer in the Border Patrol in 2018. There was, and so there was this panel of experts under the Obama administration that found that they had a tiny fraction of the number of internal affairs agents that they should. It's also hard. It's very unclear when an incident happens in a border community, like who has jurisdiction, who's first to the scene. Is it the local sheriff's office? Is it the local cops? Is it the FBI? And a system developed that Lily's organization did a wonderful job exposing, where often the first people on the scene would be basically a cover-up team within the Border Patrol that would seek to mitigate the agency's liability. And actually, Lily, could I let you say more about that?
Yes, sure. So like Katherine mentioned, a little over a year ago, SBCC uncovered this I should say, took many years to be able to gather all the evidence, but we uncovered the practice of Border Patrol within their ranks. They had this teams, the critical incident teams, and we're going to call them that, but we know that different sectors might have different names for them because they were not formed by the official process in which any unit within a law enforcement agency will be created, right? This popped first in San Diego in the 80s, and it was management level agents who were can come together to, and in their own words, prevent liability for the agent and the agency themselves as a result of a critical incident, right? So we know that for the use of force incidents that I was describing earlier, right, they will show up. We have proof that in multiple cases, but specifically I'm thinking the Anastacio Hernandez Rojas case that really was the foundation for a lot of our research. So in 2010, Anastacio Hernandez Rojas lost his life in the hands of multiple Border Patrol agents who beat him up and left him brain dead. In the investigation, we found out that as soon as the incident happened, the critical incidents team here in San Diego showed up, tampered with witness, destroy evidence by destroying footage of the incident. This incident happened very close to the port of entry, and if there's anything at the port of entry, it's definitely cameras and security surveillance that was destroyed. And we know that in other incidents, they have deported witness and will take measures, whether legal or not, to once again prevent that the agency and the agents themselves will be held liable or any sort of liability. So we know that since then, Congress acted, since we uncovered them, Congress, acted as for more information from the agency, and the response was a memo by the then commissioner of CBP to dismantle these units. But it did allow for, or still allows for, management inquiries to occur, happen when an incident is reported, which for us is still very concerning because we know that there will never be accountability when we're asking agents to investigate themselves. That's actually not happens with any other law enforcement agency, right? If there's anything, an agent is ever in a situation that needs to be investigated, is usually a different agency that comes and does that. But we know that for Border Patrol, that's still not true. They still have supervisors, managers, being present at scenes of some incidents, and we know also that a lot of the folks that were part of this critical incident teams, because there has not been, or at least we haven't seen a thorough investigation of the impact and how much they intervene in the investigation of all these cases. A lot of these agents are still part of Border Patrol and now are being kind of just transfer over to OPR that serves as their, and then it's now internal affairs. So OPR is kind of internal affairs for CBP. So these critical incident team members, now that there is no longer, or there's not supposed to be a critical incident team, now they're just being sent to OPR. So those are some of our concerns. I mean, Katherine, I know that you have also been following, so do you want to add something?
I'd say, so there are parallels between the problems with Border Patrol impunity and problems with law enforcement accountability in general. I mean, I think a lot of internal affairs agencies aren't totally effective, miss, long-running issues of corruption. There's stories from various cities of it. In Border Patrol in particular, so not only can they arrest people, but for people who don't have legal status, who might be the victims of abuse, they can deport them, and sometimes without a hearing. And so the power to deport your witnesses makes it harder to hold people accountable. There is a lot less transparency, I think, even than other law enforcement agents. In some cases where an agent has been convicted of an off-duty crime, you'd want to be able to, have a reporter pull their file, see if there were warning signs that were missed. You can't really do that. They have special exemptions from public information laws for national security reasons. They also have like the world's slowest the Freedom of Information Act office. And so it's very difficult. And I think there's also a very politically powerful and politically politicized union. And that's, not unheard of in law enforcement too, but it's quite striking. Their union was very closely allied with President Trump and has been openly hostile to the Biden administration, although the Biden administration is actually, there are more similarities than you would guess from watching the news in the Biden and Trump's administration's approach to the border. And I do think there have been people at various times, there have been efforts at reform. And, I think that disbanding the critical incident team was a good step, although I definitely share Lily's worries that the Internal Affairs Office is going to be captured and not be so effective. And they passed a new policy to tighten up some of the rules around vehicle pursuits. They've released body camera videos for the first time. But the head of the agency who instituted some of these reforms got fired less than a year into his job. And I think there's a sense that the sort of old boy network can wait out these, silly reformers from Washington. And that's really tough. There's also, there's a real issue with culture of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct that POGO has reported on. Our investigators found that the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General had covered up internal reports of sexual misconduct and domestic violence among the DHS law enforcement workforce, not restricted to Customs and Border Protection or Border Patrol, but there were quite a lot of cases in CBP.
At some point, I hope we will quickly turn to, what would reform look like? But I want to get to one of the questions that we've gotten in the chat. I can give a quick answer to the second question that came up. Has POGO needed to resort to suing CBP to respond to FOIA requests? The answer is yes. But the first question, I think, is probably something that could help clarify things for a few folks, and that's at locations other than border crossings within the 100-mile zone, how effective is Border Patrol in finding people who are in the U.S. illegally? Effectiveness might be measured, for example, as the fraction of traffic stops in which a person in the U.S. Illegally is detained. And I think this brings up maybe some questions about maybe the difference between what Border Patrol does and what ICE does. Either one of you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, there's very little good data about what is happening at the traffic stops and vehicle checkpoints. I think the best accounts I've seen of it have come from reports where civil rights organizations or others have actually filed Freedom of Information Act requests and gotten the individual forms from the stops where they arrested people. And they did find a pattern of racial profiling that was resulting in a lot of citizens being stopped and a lot of in a lot of cases, when they did find someone who was in the US illegally, it was actually someone who had entered years and years ago and was, so that would really be more within the Immigration and Customs Enforcement's jurisdiction, which is supposed to do sort of interior immigration enforcement rather than someone who had just crossed the border. But this, and then at checkpoints, I think the fact that so many arrests at checkpoints are US citizens indicates it's a pretty low hit rate, but I'm not aware of very good data about that overall.
Oh yeah, I agree with you, Katherine. There's not a lot of data, and that is actually part of the challenges. And with CBP, that they are operating with impunity and with very, very low oversight by even their own structure. And a lot of their practices are not documented as you will think, or as some other law enforcement agencies might.
We also had a question that somebody submitted before that we opened this conversation this afternoon about how does this, what we've been describing about Border Patrol intersect with immigration detention. And maybe I could just add to that. Of course, we've got the end of the official end to the pandemic this week, which also would result in the lifting of Title 42, which is something that the Trump administration had used to essentially bar asylum under the auspices of like public health. So, maybe Katherine, I know that you've recently done some writing about CBP detention, and if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. So CBP facilities are not really built to hold people overnight. There aren't beds. There's no privacy. There's no access to counsel. There's really very little contact, if any, with the outside world, I think. And the conditions can be really, there's little food, there's little water, there's like one toilet that huge number of people share. It can be very overcrowded. And those conditions are never good. They get worse when there is a large number of people held in CBP custody. And I think even before Title 42 ended, just with every time Title 42 has been supposedly about to end 4 times now, keeps being delayed by the courts and various other things. And each time there's been an increase in the number of people in custody due to the confusion. And when Border Patrol facilities, when more people are detained there, conditions get even worse. Conditions can be life-threatening there. There were, under the Trump administration, at one point there was one year where several children died in CBP custody because there's really not much in the way of healthcare either. And a lot of Border Patrol agents are somewhat hostile to migrants and to asylum seekers, and sort of view their role as to just try to impose consequences on people. And, and so as Title 42 has ended, there is an effort by the Biden administration to try to deter people from coming. And as part of that, they are they're trying to have people go through the whole immigration process in Border Patrol custody. And so that could mean that people are held there for a really, really long time in really dangerous conditions, and no access to lawyer. Like, it could get really bad, and it's very hard to figure out how to track that. And it's also very hard to see how people who have a fear of persecution can get protection under those circumstances.
Lily, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in on this question too about CBP detention.
Yes, Yeah, I mean, I think like Katherine mentioned that detention in general, right? There is challenges in all other settings, but especially for CBP, given that they are not supposed to hold people for more than, I believe it's 72 hours. But we have heard stories of people being detained by them for weeks. And these are weeks in which people don't have access to communication with the outside world. Most times don't have access even to their own lawyers, because the facilities are just don't have the infrastructure to even allow for that. As simple as the phone lines not being set up to have the usual screenings that a regular jail or a detention facility would, and therefore not being secure for people to talk to their lawyers. The facilities themselves not having even a kitchen to be able to feed people, because once again, when they were created, most of them were created in the 80s, 90s, or even before that. The expectation was never to hold people there for many days or weeks. They were also created with the intent of who was migrating in those years, right? In those times, and it was single males. But now the reality of who's being detained there is a lot of families, primarily, I will say, family units. So little children, pregnant individuals, folks with different other challenges that just the facility itself is not designed to accommodate to. But also just, from the community perspective, because the facility itself is not meant to hold people for long periods of time, people get lost in the system. So if you're a family member who suspect that your loved one was detained by CBP, so if your loved one would have been detained by ICE, there is a process for you as a loved one, as an attorney, to find your client, to find your loved one who might be detained in immigration detention facilities that are run by ICE. But if this person, for whatever reason, ended up in CBP custody, there's no process. There's no line, there's no website, there's nothing that really allows you to have access. What we hear from our legal partners is that the most effective way of finding somebody that is in CBP custody is building relationships with the agents themselves. And this is what a lot of legal attorneys end up having to do. So they will be willing to at least acknowledge to you that that person is in their custody. Otherwise, there's no way of finding them. People get lost in this black hole. And we just find them once they're on the other side, meaning whether they got deported or now we're transferred to a different agency that is more willing to share information.
Thank you both. I'm cognizant that we've got about 5 minutes left. And so I did want to turn to the question of reform, and I'm going to ask both of you the same question, which is, given the breadth of issues and concerns that we've talked about concerning CBP and Border Patrol, if you could select out one or two critical reforms that you think could really shift the culture of impunity at the agency, what would they be? Lily, I'm going to go to you first on this question.
It's hard. It's hard just to pick one or two.
I know.
I think one key change that we could make that will, as a result, trickle into a lot of the injustices and the issues that we talk about today, will be definitely address the use of force standard. And I know that this is a challenge for all law enforcement agencies, but once again, given that CBP is the largest, if we were to start there, it could hopefully result in other agencies doing the same. Currently, the use of force standard is objective, right? Is reasonable, objectively reasonable, meaning it's centered around the officer whether the officer act within reason to respond to the situation. What as SBCC we're advocating for is to adopt international standards, which tell us that the best use of force standard would be necessary and proportionate, meaning centering the life at danger, measuring if the actions were necessary, and if the actions also are proportionate to the threat. We think that if, once again, if we were to create that one, it's a big change, but that specific change, it will start addressing the violence that we see in the hands of CBP in our community. Another big one for us would be to address the racial profiling. As I think it was mentioned earlier today, border communities are very diverse communities. We have a lot of communities with majority Latino or what CBP perceives to be Mexican looking individuals, and racial profiling and just the fact that they're allowed to use a lot broader discretion than most law enforcement leaves those of us who are darker skinned, who live in the border, in a greater danger. And at this point, it's almost catching up with the rest of the country in preventing to use racial profiling as a what they call a tool, right, in their enforcement.
Thanks, Lily. Katherine, over to you.
Yeah, so one thing I would say that would help with a lot of issues is more transparency, which is not, you know, obviously like learning about abuses isn't ending them, but I think if when you get into some of the specific cases, it's not something that really anyone wants to see. And we need evidence of that, and we need to be able to figure out, you know, okay, how did this happen? And so that means not only things like, I see there's a question in the chat about body cameras. That's a step forward, but there also needs to be, you know, the footage needs to be released. The footage needs to be released to people who are abused by Border Patrol, even if it's not, you know, even if they don't end up dead. We need to know what becomes of complaints and investigations. Right now, you sort of send a letter and it just sort of goes somewhere and you don't really know whatever happened to it. So getting a lot more transparency would help, I think, create an environment where there could be more progress, even though it's not enough in itself. The other thing I would say is shrinking the jurisdiction within the 100-mile zone, putting limits on racial profiling and stops without suspicion, and then just limiting their ability to set up checkpoints in, you know, it's complicated along the southern border because people have built their lives around where checkpoints are. If you move them, it maybe makes it creates new difficulties, but in places where there aren't checkpoints now, we do not want to further expand surveillance, and we don't want them setting up checkpoints in major US cities along the coasts. We don't want them used as they were in the George Floyd protest to crack down on dissent domestically. And I think it's important and within the executive branch's power actually to limit that jurisdiction to something that prevents future abuses.
Thank you both. And I want to give you both a chance to offer our audience members a suggestion for how they can stay informed, how they can advocate for accountability. We can certainly, you know, put some resources in the chat, but we welcome you sharing those ideas. 30 seconds.
Oh my gosh, ask Lily. She's the she's on the ground.
Yeah, there is so much, but really staying informed on the realities of the border will be a great help for the work that we do. Because once again, as somebody that has lived all my life in this, in the region and for generations, we're constantly, we know that our realities are not the same. So if you're able to help us do one thing, is help us debunk this myth that the border is a line in the sand where it's just isolated and it's just there's things coming across the border. The borders communities are vibrant communities. They're diverse. We have families. We have communities that have formed around the border, and this is our home. And if you help us at least debunk that one myth, it will be a lot better. It will help us a lot in the advocacy for our communities.
Thank you, Lily. And thank you, Katherine, for both of you for sharing your experience and your expertise. And a huge thanks to everyone who joined us this afternoon. At POGO, we are continuing to do a lot of advocacy with the executive branch and Congress and trying to transform CBP. And we welcome your support and contributions in that effort. So thank you to SBCC for all your amazing work that you continue to do on behalf of everyone who lives along the border. Have a good afternoon.